snow fell like the end of everything, not gentle, not peaceful. It came down heavy and cold, covering a land that looked like God himself had given up on it. The fields were black and dead. The fence posts stood broken. Nothing had grown here since summer, and now winter was burying what was left. A man walked through it alone. His horse limped behind him, ribs showing through its hide like the bars of a cage. Every step crunched through ice that sounded like breaking bones. The man had no name anymore. Everyone who'd called him brother or friend or husband was either scattered to the wind or buried in the ground. His coat was torn. Frost clung to his beard like grave dust. He'd been moving since dawn, but the sun had barely showed itself, just a red smear behind the trees before it gave up and sank away. He had nowhere to go but forward. Backward was death, and death didn't need his help finding him. Then the storm rose. A gray wall swallowed the horizon. His raw, split hands gripped the reins tighter. He thought about the cabin he'd left 2 winters ago, the woman sleeping by the fire, the words he never said. Regret had a way of thawing even frozen men, and for the first time in years, he wished he'd let it. That's when he saw the house. At first, he wasn't sure it was real. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, thin as a dying prayer. The place stood alone like a wound in the snow, a widow's shack with a sagging porch and a roof patched with rusty tin. One window glowed faintly with lamplight. He tied his horse and knocked. Soft, uncertain. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and the door creaked open like something waking from a long sleep. Inside, it smelled of damp wool and boiled grain. A woman stood by the stove, thin-faced, hollow-eyed from too many sleepless nights. Behind her, 2 children sat on the floor in coats too big for their small bodies. One of them held a crust of bread like it was the last thing on earth. Then the smaller child whispered, "Are we allowed to eat this?" The words cut through him sharper than the wind. The woman spun around, her hand halfway to the pistol on the shelf, before she saw the exhaustion written all over him. She lowered the gun slowly, breathing out hard. "I ain't here to steal," he said, voice rough from cold and guilt. "Just need a place to wait out the storm." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes tracing the frost on his coat, the emptiness in his face. "There ain't much here worth taking," she said quietly, stepping aside. "But you can sit, if you mean no harm." He nodded and crossed the threshold. Heat from the stove hit him like mercy he didn't deserve. He crouched near it, hands shaking as blood tried to remember how to move. The woman poured a tin cup of broth, thin as river water, and handed it to him. He didn't drink right away. Instead, he looked at the 2 children. One had hair the color of dried hay. The other had eyes too old for a child. "You their ma?" he asked. She nodded. "Since the Lord saw fit to take their pa 3 winters past." He lowered his gaze, ashamed he'd even asked. "Hard land," he murmured. "It don't know how to be any other way," she replied, turning back to the pot. "Storm's likely to cut us off till morning." He sipped the broth. It barely filled him, but it was something. The children watched him like he was a ghost, stepped out of a story their father once told. The woman worked quietly, her movements efficient, but weary, the kind of weariness that comes from the bones outward. Outside, the wind howled and slammed against the house. The boards shuddered. The lamp flickered. For a moment, he thought he might vanish back into the cold where he belonged. But then he saw the children lean into each other, sharing warmth, and something inside him shifted. Something buried for too long. When the woman finally spoke again, her voice was softer. "You got a name?" He hesitated, like saying it might bring back everything he'd lost. "Elias," he said. She nodded. Though she didn't say anything more, The air between them changed, less brittle, more human. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt the faintest edge of belonging, like a thaw at the end of a merciless winter. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that cabin, 3 breaths and one stranger's silence held fast against it. The night stretched long and heavy. The wind scraped at the windows like something trying to claw its way in. Elias sat by the stove until the last ember faded to a dull red eye. The woman, her name was Clara, he'd learned, spread a quilt for the children near the fire and took the chair by the door. She watched the storm through the window, face half lit, shoulders squared like someone used to keeping watch over things that might not survive. Elias tried to sleep, but it came in broken pieces. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the faces of men long gone. His brother dying on the trail, his father's voice thick with disappointment. The woman in Kansas he'd left with a promise he never kept. When he finally woke, the world was silent. Morning light crept through cracks in the shutters, thin and uncertain. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, oats boiling in the pot. Clara noticed him watching and nodded toward the table. "There's enough for a bowl," she said. "Ain't much, but it's warm." He stood, joints stiff from cold and exhaustion. "You've done more than I deserve." "Deserving's got little to do with it," she said, handing him a spoon. "We do what we can." He ate slowly, savoring each bite like it might be his last. The oats were thin, stretched with water, but they tasted like kindness. Outside, snow lay deep and white, the world hushed beneath it. He thought of leaving, but the thought of that endless white plain made his hands tighten around the bowl. "You from around here?" Clara asked, folding a blanket. Her voice was casual but cautious. "Farther west," he said. "Worked cattle till there weren't any left to work." She nodded, unsurprised. "Seems to be the story for most men who come through. The land takes more than it gives." He studied her. Dark hair streaked with gray, worry, not age. Her hands bore small burns and scars from work. She was young still, maybe 30, but her eyes carried years beyond that. "What keeps you here?" he asked. She paused. The folding stopped halfway. "My husband's buried here," she said simply. "And the children don't deserve to lose another place." Elias looked toward the window where the horizon lay hidden. "Hard to bury the living along with the dead," he said softly. Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. "Sometimes you don't get to choose." For a while they said nothing. The only sound was the creak of the stove and the children stirring awake. The younger one, a girl, rubbed her eyes and smiled shyly at Elias. The boy, older and sharper, watched him with quiet suspicion, as if trying to decide whether the stranger was danger or salvation. When the wind eased, Clara opened the door. Light flooded in, harsh and clean. Snow was piled halfway up the fence. The fields beyond gleamed like silver glass. Elias stepped outside, boots sinking deep. He helped her haul wood from the shed, muscles aching but grateful for the work. "You can stay till the road clears," she said after a while. "No one should ride out in this." He nodded. "I'll work for my keep." "That'd be fair." Through the day, they worked together in the silence of shared labor, mending the door, chopping wood, checking on the mare shivering in the lean-to. Elias moved with the slow precision of someone long used to solitude. Clara worked with quiet purpose, as though every motion had been weighed before she made it. At midday, they rested on the porch. The storm clouds had broken, leaving a wide, pale sky. Elias held his hands out to the faint sun. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that if I just kept moving, I could outrun what I'd done." Clara turned toward him. "And now?" He gave a small, crooked smile. Now I reckon I've been running in circles." She said nothing, but there was understanding in her gaze, too deep for words. When the children came out, the girl holding a small rag doll, Clara's voice softened. She told them to stay close, to watch their step. Elias noticed how her tone changed, how the hardness melted for them. Something in his chest loosened. Later, when dusk came and the air turned sharp again, he helped stack wood by the stove, while Clara ladled out stew thickened with the last of the grain. They ate quietly, the four of them, while the fire cast a golden hue on the walls. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel the urge to leave before dawn. Outside, the world slept beneath its white shroud. Inside, the widow's house glowed like a fragile ember refusing to die. And somewhere in the silence, something was beginning. The next morning dawned blue and brittle. Frost clung to the window like delicate lacework. Elias woke before the rest, drawn by the silence, the kind that only comes after a storm, when the world feels briefly forgiven. He stood at the door, boots unlaced, watching light crawl over the drifts. Behind him, Clara stirred. "You're up early," she said, voice soft from sleep. He nodded without turning. "Habit. Hard to unlearn the road." She came beside him, shawl pulled close. "Out there it's all white. Looks peaceful till you step into it." He smiled faintly. "Peace don't always mean mercy." Her eyes lingered on him just a moment too long, as though she'd seen something familiar in his weariness. "You'll need to stay a few more days," she said finally. "The trail east won't hold a horse yet." Elias thought of arguing, but the words died before they reached his tongue. He nodded. "All right." They spent the morning clearing the porch and the path to the well. The work was slow, but the rhythm of it, shovel, breath, pause, eased something between them. The boy, Daniel, joined in with stubborn pride, his small hands clumsy on the handle. The girl, Mary, followed behind, dragging a wooden spoon through the snow like a plow. The sound of her laughter startled Elias. It had been a long time since he'd heard laughter that wasn't hollow. When they rested, Clara handed him coffee. Thin and bitter, but warm. "Daniel says you used to work cattle," she said. "Used to," he answered. "Before the herds dried out and the men stopped paying. Spent the last 2 years drifting." "You had family." He looked out across the field where the wind shaped snow into ridges like waves. "Once," he said quietly. "Lost a brother on the trail. Lost the rest by my own hand, I guess. Too proud to stay. Too scared to make it right." Clara didn't reply right away. She just nodded, eyes lowered. "Pride's a kind of hunger," she said after a while. "It eats what you love before you even taste it." He met her gaze, and something in him flinched, not from her words, but from how true they felt. By afternoon, the sky had cleared. The sun shone hard on the snow, throwing back brightness that hurt the eyes. Clara sent Daniel to gather kindling, while she washed clothes in a basin near the fire. Elias helped, awkwardly. His big hands were unfit for such delicate work. She laughed once, quiet, surprised. "You wash like a man breaking rocks." He gave her a look, half amused. "Ain't much call for gentleness on the trail." "Maybe there should be." The room went still after that. Their laughter faded into a silence that wasn't empty, but full, thick with something unnamed. She looked down, rinsing the cloth, and he caught the tremor of her hands. When evening came, the wind picked up again, sharp and cutting. They ate in near darkness, the stew barely stretching far enough. Mary fell asleep first, her head against her mother's lap. Daniel lingered longer, watching Elias with the weary fascination boys have for men who look like they've survived too much. Before bed, Clara brought out a small wooden box and set it on the table. "My husband made this," she said, running her fingers over the lid. "Used to carve in the evenings. Said it kept his hands busy so his mind wouldn't wander." She opened it. Inside were small figures, animals mostly, rough-hewn but careful. "They're fine work," Elias said. "He never finished the last one," she said softly, lifting a half-shaped horse. "Died that winter before it was done." Elias reached out, tracing the grooves of the wood. "Maybe some things ain't meant to be finished," he said. Clara looked at him then, eyes bright in the lamplight. "Maybe some are," she replied. He didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't. He just sat there, the half-carved horse between them, the air thick with things neither could yet say. Outside, the wind howled over the plains, but inside there was warmth enough to hold back the dark. And as Elias lay down that night, the sound of the widow's quiet breathing nearby filled the silence that had lived in him too long. Days passed in a slow thaw. Each morning began with the scrape of Elias's boots on the porch, the creak of the pump handle, the faint rise of smoke from the chimney. He found rhythm again, the kind a man forgets he needs until it steadies him. Clara tended to her chores with the same quiet purpose, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, eyes always somewhere far off. Elias helped where he could. He fixed the fence where it leaned toward collapse, oiled the door hinges, cleared the path to the barn. He mended the boy's broken sled, using a scrap of leather from his saddlebag. When Daniel tested it down the hill behind the house, his laughter rang out across the field. Even the crows seemed startled. Mary clapped and ran after her brother, red scarf streaming behind like a small banner of hope. Clara stood on the porch, arms folded, and smiled. Not broadly, but enough for Elias to see the woman she must have been before. Grief pressed her shoulders low. That night, when the children were asleep, she poured him coffee and sat across the table. The lamplight softened the lines on her face. "It's been a long while since they laughed like that," she said. Elias nodded. "Children ought to laugh. They don't know yet what's coming for them." She looked at him steadily. "You say that like the world's already taken all it can." He hesitated, thumb tracing the rim of the cup. "It near has." She leaned forward slightly. "Maybe that's because you keep handing it over." Her words hung between them, not cruel, just true. Elias felt them sink deep. He'd been running from the ache so long he'd mistaken it for motion. "You talk plain," he said. "Out here, there's no use talking fancy. The wind doesn't listen." They shared a quiet laugh, short, uncertain, but real. Later, when the fire burned low, Elias stepped outside. The stars had come out, cold and countless. The snow glowed faintly beneath them. The land stretched wide and empty, a pale ocean frozen mid-breath. He thought of his brother's grave near the Cimarron, of the woman he'd left behind with promises like dust. For the first time, the weight of it didn't crush him. It just sat there like an old scar that no longer bled. The next day brought visitors. A wagon rolled up the hill near noon, pulled by two tired mules. The man driving wore a heavy coat and a deputy's badge tarnished by years. He climbed down stiffly, nodding toward Clara. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, "heard tell you got company." Clara's jaw tightened. "We've got help, not trouble." The deputy's gaze moved to Elias, sharp, measuring. "Name?" Elias straightened. "Elias Kane." Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. "Heard that name once. Weren't you riding with the carriage outfit down near Bent Canyon?" Elias met his stare evenly. "Was." The deputy nodded slowly. "That outfit ended ugly. Some men didn't walk away." "I did," Elias said, "and I've been walking since." The man studied him for a long moment, then spat into the snow. Well, I ain't here to stir ghosts, just checking that everything up this way is decent. His tone softened slightly as he turned back to Clara. You watch yourself, ma'am. Times are lean. Folks get desperate. Clara thanked him, though her eyes had gone hard. When the wagon finally disappeared down the hill, the silence it left was thick as fog. He's right, Elias said quietly. Times are lean. You keep a pistol near? I do, she said, looking at him unflinching. But I'd rather not have cause to use it again. He nodded, understanding more in her tone than her words. That night, Daniel asked if the man would come back. Clara brushed his hair aside and told him no, though her voice carried a tremor. Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his knife in slow strokes, his thoughts turning dark. He'd seen what hunger could make of men. By the next morning, he'd made a decision. He hitched the mare to the small sled and packed what little he had, his knife, his coat, his will to make things right. When Clara came out, she looked at the bundle, then at him. You leaving? She asked, voice quiet but steady. Not far, he said. Nearest town's 2 days' ride. I'll bring back supplies, grain, salt, maybe coffee if they got any. Her brow furrowed. That's a hard road. I've walked harder. She hesitated, then reached for his sleeve. Elias, if you don't come back. He met her eyes, the pale morning light catching in them like water. I will, he said. Reckon I've run enough for one lifetime. And before she could speak again, he turned toward the horizon where snow and sky met, his figure shrinking against the blinding white until he became just another shadow moving across the plains. Inside, Clara stood at the doorway long after he vanished. One hand on the frame, the other pressed to her chest, as if she could still feel the echo of his promise beating faintly there. The wind had stilled to a whisper by the time Elias reached the river valley. Snow lay deep there, crusted over by days of frost. He moved steady, conserving what strength he had. The sky had turned the color of pewter, low and brooding. He followed the faint track of the old road, now nearly swallowed by drifts. Each step crunched, echoing in the stillness. He'd packed enough dried meat to last a day, maybe 2. A flask of water he kept tucked beneath his coat to keep from freezing. But more than hunger or cold, it was the silence that gnawed at him, the kind that made a man remember. He thought of Clara's face as he left, the way her hand lingered on his sleeve, the tremor in her breath, the children, Mary waving from the window, Daniel trying to stand straight as a man, pretending not to care. It had been a long while since anyone had looked at him with trust. The weight of it was almost more than the snow he trudged through. By midday, clouds rolled in from the west, gray and heavy. The wind rose again, sharper, meaner. Snow came fast, blinding and bitter. Elias pulled his collar up, leaning into it, body hunched against the force. The world shrank to white and wind. He found an old barn by chance, half buried near the riverbank. The roof sagged, one side caved in, but it was shelter. Inside, the air smelled of rot and dust. He brushed snow from a fallen beam and sat, breathing hard, the ache in his legs pulsing like heat. He'd been a fool, promises made too easily, faith spoken too late. But then he saw Clara's eyes again in his mind, the steadiness, the quiet strength. That look had followed him long after he turned away. It steadied him now. He tore a strip of jerky, chewed slowly, then leaned back and closed his eyes. When morning came, the storm had passed. The sun was pale, thin as parchment, but it was light enough to move on. By noon he saw the dark line of buildings in the distance. Ridge Hollow. Little more than a cluster of shacks, a blacksmith, a trading post, and a church whose bell had long gone silent. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped in. The warmth hit him first, followed by the scent of tobacco and flour. A man behind the counter looked up, beard white, eyes narrow. "Can I help you?" "Need grain, salt, coffee if you got it. Enough for 4. The man sized him up. "You're a long way from anywhere, friend." "Storm caught me out near the widow Harlow's place," Elias said. At the mention of her name, the storekeeper's brows lifted. "That woman still holding out up there. Heard she near starved last winter." "She's holding," Elias said, his tone making it clear there'd be no gossip. The man shrugged and began measuring flour into a sack. "You one of her kin?" "No, just passing through." "Well," the man said, weighing the bag, "passing through is fine, so long as you're paying. Times being what they are, I can't spare much on charity." Elias laid a few coins on the counter, his last. The man frowned but took them. "That won't stretch far." Elias reached into his coat and drew a small silver brooch, tarnished and dented, shaped like a swallow in flight. "Take this too," he said. "It's worth more than the grain." The storekeeper turned it in his fingers, nodding. "Fair enough. You'll get your supplies." When Elias stepped back into the cold, the sky was beginning to gray again. He packed the grain and salt tight, securing the load on the sled. But before he could leave, a voice called from across the street. "Elias Kane." He turned. The deputy from before stood there, hand near his gun. "I thought I might see you here," the man said. "You've got a past that follows you, Kane." Elias didn't move. "Ain't planning to trouble anyone." "Maybe not, but trouble's got a long memory." Elias looked at him steady. "Then let it remember me paying my debts." The deputy hesitated, then spat into the snow. "You head back to that widow's place. Tell her to keep her lantern low. Some men been sniffing around up that way. Desperate ones." Elias's jaw tightened. "What kind?" "The kind that take more than food when they're hungry." Elias nodded once. "Then I'd best be on my way." He turned without another word, leading the sled back toward the hills. The deputy watched him go, the wind tugging at his coat. As the sun dipped low behind the ridges, Elias felt the cold rise again, sharper than before. But beneath it, there was something else. A heat. Fierce and wordless. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was purpose. He was no longer walking away from something. He was walking toward it. The journey back was crueler than the one out. The storm had crusted the snow into jagged ridges sharp enough to cut a horse's hoof or a man's spirit. Elias pushed on anyway, one foot before the other, the sled dragging behind like a stubborn ghost. The weight of grain and salt dug furrows into the drifts. Each breath burned his chest raw. By the second night, the moon rose thin and white above the plains. The wind had stilled, but the cold had deepened, heavy, absolute. He found shelter beneath a bluff of rock, started a small fire, wrapped himself in his coat. His hands shook as he ate the last of his jerky. He thought of Clara again, the steady rhythm of her movements, the way her voice softened when she spoke to the children, the faint line of worry between her brows that never quite left. It struck him that she had built her life not out of hope, but out of refusal. She refused to die, refused to yield, refused to forget how to care. And somehow, in her presence, he had begun to remember the same. He slept little. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of a house warm with light, the smell of coffee and wood smoke. Clara sat at the table, hands folded, eyes fixed on the door. Then the door opened, and the dream turned to darkness. He woke with a start, heart pounding, snowflakes falling through the hole in the bluff above him. By dawn, he was moving again. When he crested the final hill, he saw the house below, its roof a thin gray line against the snow. Smoke trailed from the chimney, but there was something wrong in the air. The smoke rose too thick, too dark. He quickened his pace. As he drew closer, he saw the door half open. Snow blown inside. Footprints scattered around the porch, more than one pair. His gut clenched. He dropped the rope, the sled sliding to a stop behind him, and ran. Inside, the room was chaos. The table overturned, chairs broken, a lamp shattered against the hearth. Clara stood near the stove, hair loose, one arm wrapped around Mary, who clung to her skirts and sobbed. Daniel crouched behind a chair, gripping the small rifle Elias had seen propped by the door days before. Two men stood near the center of the room, one tall and gaunt, beard matted with frost, the other shorter, younger, with a scar along his cheek. They turned when Elias entered, surprise flashing across their faces. "Well, look what wandered in," the tall one said, voice rough. "Didn't figure she had company." Elias's hand went to his belt, but his gun was frozen stiff from the cold. "You picked the wrong house," he said. The tall man grinned, showing yellow teeth. "We just came for food, but maybe there's more worth taking." Clara's voice cut through the air, sharp as glass. "You'll take nothing." The younger man laughed and stepped forward. But Elias moved faster. He swung with his fist, connecting hard against the man's jaw. The man fell back, crashing into the table. The tall one lunged, drawing a knife. Elias caught his wrist, the two of them grappling, boots sliding on the blood-slick floor. The smell of smoke and sweat filled the room. Daniel fired. The sound split the air like thunder. The shot missed, striking the wall inches from the tall man's head, but it was enough. The younger one scrambled to his feet and bolted for the door, shouting. The tall man shoved Elias back and followed, stumbling into the snow. Elias stood there, chest heaving, knuckles raw. The cold rushed in through the open door, biting at his lungs. He turned toward Clara. She was trembling, pistol in her hand, still aimed at the doorway. "They'll come back," she whispered. "Not if I find them first," Elias said. Her eyes met his, fierce and pleading all at once. "Elias, don't!" But he was already pulling on his coat. "I ain't letting them think this house can be taken." He stepped into the snow, gun finally drawn, breath fogging in the dim light. The trail of the men was clear, two sets of footprints veering toward the trees. He followed. The cold bit deep, but he didn't feel it. It was dark when he returned. The bodies of the two men lay far out in the ravine, covered by drifting snow. He had buried them shallow, the way a man does when the ground is too hard to care. When Clara saw him at the door, she said nothing. She just reached out and touched his sleeve, fingers trembling. "You shouldn't have gone." He looked at her, eyes hollow but steady. "Had to. They'd have come again." The fire behind her glowed warm and gold. She stepped closer, voice breaking. "You could have died." He nodded. "Maybe, but not before I kept you safe." For a long time, neither spoke. Then quietly she reached for his hand. Her palm was cold, but sure. And when their fingers met, something in both of them settled, like the wind finally laying down after a long storm. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow, covering the blood and footprints alike. By morning, the snow had blanketed the plains clean again, as though the night's violence had never been. The air carried that hollow, crystalline quiet that comes after the worst has passed. Elias stood outside with the shovel, clearing the porch while Clara moved about inside, her motions deliberate, controlled. From the chimney rose a steady line of smoke, the sign of a house that refused to die. Daniel came out, small boots crunching over the crusted drifts. He held the rifle close to his chest, uncertain whether to be proud or ashamed of having fired it. Elias leaned on the shovel and studied the boy. "You handled yourself right yesterday," he said. "A man don't always hit what he's aiming for, but standing your ground matters more." Daniel looked down. "Mama said not to shoot unless there's no other way." Elias nodded. "She's right. There's always a cost when you do." The boy hesitated. "Are they gone for good?" Elias's jaw tightened. "They won't trouble her again." Daniel nodded, satisfied enough, and went to fetch more wood. Elias watched him disappear behind the barn. The world felt heavy with silence again, not the dead kind, but the kind that lingers when something's been settled. Inside, Clara was kneeling by the hearth, coaxing flame from the kindling. Her sleeves were rolled, hair undone. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the hard lines of worry that had lived there too long. "You should rest," Elias said quietly as he came in. "You barely closed your eyes last night." She didn't look up. Couldn't. Every sound felt like them coming back. He crouched beside her, took the poker from her hand, and stirred the coals. "They won't come back." She glanced at him then, voice small. "You're certain?" "I buried that kind of certainty myself, years ago," he said. "But I'm sure enough." She studied him, and something in her gaze softened. "You talk like a man who's been running from ghosts." "Been running so long," he said, "I forgot what it felt like to stop." For a while neither spoke. The fire crackled, casting warm shadows across the walls. Mary came down from the loft, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Clara gathered her up, whispering soft words. Elias turned away, the tenderness of that moment too raw to watch. By noon, the house had steadied itself again. Elias repaired the door where it had splintered. Clara scrubbed the blood from the floorboards until the wood looked new. It wasn't erasure. It was a kind of defiance, the act of reclaiming what had nearly been taken. When evening came, they sat together at the table. The stew was thin, but no one complained. The children ate quietly, eyes heavy with the kind of weariness that belongs to both fear and safety. After they were asleep, Clara remained at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Elias sat across from her, hat resting on his knee. "I don't know how to thank you," she said at last. He shook his head. "Don't. Just keep living." "That's not as simple as you make it sound." He gave a faint, weary smile. "Ain't nothing simple about living, but it's worth the trouble sometimes." She looked at him for a long time. "You could stay," she said quietly. "The barn needs fixing come spring. There's more land than I can tend alone." The words hung in the air, soft and trembling. Elias looked down at his hands, scarred, cracked, uncertain. He had left behind too many places, too many faces that once offered him peace. But here, in this small house with its crooked door and stubborn fire, he felt something stir that he'd thought was long dead. "I could," he said finally, "if you're sure." "I'm sure," she answered, voice steady now. "But only if you want it, not because you think you owe me." He met her eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man pretending at decency. "I ain't staying out of debt," he said. "I'm staying because I want to see what comes after." Clara nodded and her shoulders eased. She stood then, slow, deliberate, and crossed to the window. Outside, the snow had begun again, falling soft as breath. "The land will heal," she said. "It always does if you let it." Elias joined her at the window. Together they watched the flakes drift past, catching in the lantern light. The silence between them was no longer the silence of grief. It was the kind that carried a promise. When she turned toward him, her face was close enough that he could see the faint lines at the corners of her mouth, the trace of warmth returning there. "Spring will come late," she murmured. He smiled faintly. Then we've got time to be ready for it." She reached up, resting her hand lightly against his chest, where the heart beat slow from too many winters. He covered her hand with his, rough and sure. Outside, the world lay quiet beneath its shroud of white, waiting. Inside, the widow's lamp burned steady, its light falling across two figures who had stopped running, at least for a while. And somewhere beyond the fields, a new wind stirred, the kind that spoke not of endings, but of beginning again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that like button and drop a comment below, telling us which moment hit you hardest. More stories like this are coming your way. Make sure you're here for them.